Hey, everybody. Welcome to our program for today. My name is Tim, and like always, I'm going to be introducing John Quarstein. Today's program will be a good one. So I just want to let you know about a couple of things coming up. Our next program is going to be on September 11th at noon, and that's going to be about the USS Hatteras. That is also going to be hosted on Zoom. So we're going to be switching our format here a little bit with a eye on more audience participation and better engagement for everybody. We also want to let you know that we have our blog, and you can see a blog post about today's program with more details, and also just like check out our blog. We frequently update it with posts from all over the museum about all sorts of cool stuff that we're doing here, from conservation to our collection to history as well. So it's cool stuff. I also want to let you know that we're doing a Q&A session at the end, like always. So go ahead and submit those questions, and we'll get John to answer those. So without further ado, we're going to kick it over to John.
Good day, everyone. Of course, I'm John Quarstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum, and it's really great for us to share all this really powerful content that we have. I've written blogs for every one of my lectures, so you certainly can go to the website and see those, plus past programs which are preserved on YouTube, and we will continue to do that in the future. But I'm not here to talk about myself, let me tell you. I'm here to talk about the city of Newport News, particularly the founding of the city of Newport News. And so I want to start with, in 1607, when the colonists came into the Chesapeake Bay, then into what is known as, they stopped at what's called Strawberry Banks, fields of wild strawberries. They had a great time, met the Kicquetan Indians, and then they went to a place they call Point Hope. And Point Hope is on Jamestown's map, which I think you should be seeing right now. This is a kind of fanciful view. And anyway, I think John is noted for actually coming up with the name of Newport News. Now, Newport News is, here you go. This is a great picture of Christopher Newport himself. And Christopher Newport, of course, is the man who commanded the ships that went over from England to here in Virginia.
Hey, John.
And yeah,
just want to cut in real quick. We lost your screen share.
Okay.
So it's starting now. If you could go ahead and just click, click that. So you're sharing now. You just need to click. Full screen, make it full screen for everybody, which is over from beginning.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, Oops, well, that's ahead of it. Anyway, I'll start with this. So where did this name Newport News come from becomes the greatest question. And you start to see it on a map as early as 1619. And they spelled it Newport's apostrophe news. And so everyone gets confused because no one stood up one day and waved their hands and said, oh my gosh, this is Newport News. Kind of like how they did Portsmouth and Norfolk and Hampton. So the big confusion is, where did this name come from? They also spelled it sometimes Newportes, news, and that es is in place of a apostrophe. So that's how the Old English did it. Okay, so to be widely printed as Newport's News. Now, how do we get that name? And, you know, the big thing is that many believe it's connected with the starving time in Virginia when the colonists decided to abandon Jamestown. Well, all of a sudden showing up is Christopher Newport along with Lord de Delaware, and they said, we're going back and we're going to make this happen. And so basically, that's one of the connections with the names. However, there are all these folk etymologists who try to make it different. And so, like some say it's called New space Port space Noose, Newce. And that's because these two men come to the area, Thomas Noose and William Noose, and they're from Port Noose, Ireland. So we're not so sure about that one. According to Edward Everett Hale, now you may all know him from writing Man Without a Country. Also, he spoke before Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. So he's a real noted person. And so what he said was, oh my gosh, you're missing it all, because Ness in Old Scottish and English, Ness is a headland or a point of land entering into a water. So as a result of that, they says, well, this is named, you should have Ness instead of News. Well, I have to tell you, what is fabled or what is real truth, we're not so sure. But the most obvious reason why they call it Newport's News is because Newport made 5 trips from England to the colonies and back and forth. And as he was doing it, as the colony was young, he was bringing, according to Captain John Smith, that most important cargo, news. Wow. So Newport News is going to continue to just be Newport News. No one really pays it much attention to it. In fact, the first time now there's a farm there at outbreak of the Civil War, the Parker West Farm. They had a couple of wharfs going out into the water, and they Ben Butler on May 27, 1862, is going to occupy Newport News Point. They make a big camp there, and he does so because he says deep water, freshwater springs, and they decide to bring 2 ships there. One of them is the USS Cumberland, and the other one is the USS Congress. Now, these are sailing warships, so they also have, in the middle of this picture, you'll see the tug Zouave, and that's in case they need to move these boats in time of need, what have you. They are just anchored out in the stream, and so that the Confederates can't take things from Richmond down to Norfolk, and that's a big problem. They have to go by rail instead. So all of a sudden, Newport News is going to become extremely famous when on March 8th, 1862, the CSS Virginia, the Confederate ironclad ram, comes out of the Elizabeth River, and they will ram the USS Cumberland, which is off to our right, and then turn around, a half-hour turnaround. Cumberland sinks, goes back, and bombards the USS Congress. And so there is the beginning of fame for Newport News. This is the first time that an ironclad has sunk a wooden ship. They prove the power of iron over wood. The next day, right near Newport News Point, is going to be the Battle of the Ironclads. Well, now, all of a sudden, Newport's News is famous because of this Battle of the Ironclads. However, the war caused great dislocation for the Americans, or the Southerners especially. There's actually a POW camp right next to this water battery called Newport News. That's the first time you see the spelling without the apostrophe S, Newport News Point. So now, let's go back to the guy that really makes a difference. I'm trying to advance my slides, but that's okay. There we go. That's that battle. And here's the guy that's going to really make a difference. And this man, it just so happens to be Collis Potter Huntington. Now, let's just say, at one time he was a Yankee peddler. And according to lore, maybe established by Huntington himself, he came to Newport News and he later reflected that it was a point so designed and adapted by nature that it would require comparatively little at the hand of man to fit our purposes. The roadstead, well known to all maritime circles, is large enough to float the ocean commerce. It is never troubled by ice, and there is enough depth of water to float any ship that sails the seas, and at the same time is so sheltered that ships can lie there perfectly safely at all times of the year. Oh my gosh, he said there was no better place for a city. Well, Huntington then goes to California. He makes a bunch of money. He has a bunch of railroads. And after you create the Transcontinental Railroad, what do you do next? Well, this is a much longer story, comes to Virginia. He will decide to stay in Virginia, and he will buy the bankrupt Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. And so he secretly has his corporation, which is known as the Old Dominion Land Company, to buy up land down at Newport News. Now, Huntington could have gone to West Point, Virginia. He could have gone to Yorktown, both deep water. He could have gone to Norfolk. However, he knew he wanted to control everything. And so he decides that he creates his own town, lays out lots, builds a hotel, the Warwick Hotel, the casino grounds for pleasure. The railroad is coming in, bringing coal. So he has the coal yards and grain elevators, because they also bring down grain from the Shenandoah Valley. They're bringing coal from West Virginia, and guess what? Huntington owns the coal mines. He owns the railroads. He owns the dock, but he doesn't own the ships. He can't control the repair of the ships. So, like he did so many other places, he would get a secondary type of operation going, and that would be what was known as the shipyard, as we call it today. And originally it was called Chesapeake Dry Dock and Construction Company. In 1886, the Puritan, which we see before us, is the first ship to dry dock for free, because Huntington knew how to promote himself. And so he had the likes of Walt Whitman and Governor Fitzhugh Lee of Virginia, Joachim Miller, these great poets. They all were waxing eloquently about this city that was rising out of pasture into something that would change the world. Now, I have to tell you that Huntington would be later renamed the Newport News Dry Dock and Construction Company. And this is very important in our timeline because the yard starts to expand. Huntington built this yard as an afterthought to repair ships, and he thought he'd sell it to a major shipbuilder, but he just wanted to be the founder of this industry. Well, he decided to keep it. And so this is one of the most patriotic events in Newport News. And I got to tell you a story. Huntington actually wanted to call the town Minnetonka, right? And this is back in 1880. And so he declares this to the citizens, and the citizens say, oh, no. Newport News is what this has been called since the colonial times, and so we want to continue it. It's the only defeat Huntington had on the peninsula, Because just remember, he owns the land that the houses get built on. He owns the hotel. He owns everything. The waterworks, the gas works. One of his creatures or staff members organizes a separate company with the support of Eddie Huntington, and that brings us our first streetcar system. So by this scene, which is 1898, Newport News has evolved into a major shipbuilding city. The forefront is the Kearsarge, in the background is the Kentucky. My favorite story about this is that, there's the anti-temperance movement, and the daughter of the governor of Kentucky was part of that. So when they launched the Kearsarge, she breaks water from the spring where Abraham Lincoln was born. When it's time to launch the Kentucky, they all are upset because really the spirited stuff has to break on the bow of a ship. And so what's going to happen is that when they launch it, the main bottle is a bottle of spring water from the birthplace of Jefferson Davis, which was just a few miles away from where Lincoln was born. As a result of this, they also there's a great sketch, and actually in the Mariners Museum, we have one, Old Pepper Bourbon, these little bottles, right? And they threw them, most of them half empty at the ship as it's going down the ways. Well, I got to tell you that Newport News now is a household name. It has school systems, it's got commercial centers, it's got 3 thriving industries, and a rising population. However, Huntington, this is his picture of the Hotel Warwick. And there's part of the Hotel Warwick that still stands in downtown Newport News. This was his chance to try to make Newport News also a holiday destination. But he couldn't outdo Old Point Comfort, so he works a deal with Harrison Phoebus about extending the C&O onto Fort Monroe, where that becomes milepost 0. So, but I got to tell you, when Huntington dies, his wife, Arabella Duval Yarrington Huntington, will inherit the yard, and his nephew, Henry Edwards Huntington, becomes the board of directors. Now, he's real smart because he lets the business of the operation of the yard to those to know how to do it right. So first, Walter Post, who became the first mayor of Newport News. You see, Newport News was consolidated or was named a city separated from Warwick County. And as a result of that, they elect their first mayor, Walter Post. And then eventually a man known as Albert Hopkins becomes president of the yard. And sadly to say, you can just see the grain elevators in this pic. The city is rapidly growing. The shipyard is rapidly going, as you can see by this image. So they name Albert Hopkins president of the yard. And back in those days, to sign a contract, you couldn't email them. So he decided he had to go to England to knock off some contracts for ship repair and actually building freighters or merchant ships for Great Britain. Well, en route there, he picked the Lusitania to get there on. And as a result of it, he dies on May 7th, 1915, when he went down with the Lusitania. And immediately, Huntington names Homer Ferguson to be part of the president of the yard. And right immediately, he spends almost $500,000 making improvements to the yard because Ferguson knew, that war was going to see us involved. And so, believe it or not, the shipyard had $100 million worth of contracts to build battleships, battle cruisers, destroyers, and transports. They also repaired during the war 1,400 ships that had been damaged en route, what have you. Actually, on one day, July 4th, 1918, the shipyard has this great effort known as Liberty Launching Day, which at the same time, they launched the USS Thomas, the USS Huntington, and the USS Abbott. And the great thing about it is that each one, according to the Daily Press, was a death blow to Prussianism. Well, so all of a sudden, Newport News is a boomtown beyond all expectations. And why? Well, when the war happened, they decide that they're going to name Newport News as the headquarters of the Hampton Roads port of our embarkation. Remember, we got to send all our troops overseas so that they can be part of the great effort to saving the world for democracy. Oh my gosh. So, however, Newport News had a pre-war population of 23,000. So it's going to double almost virtually to 47,000. Some of those are transits, but there's not housing for everyone. And in fact, some people who had never had thought about bringing in a boarder, the money was such a lure. And some people, they rented rooms, and they'd rent rooms to 3 people, which is known as hotbedding. So time for me to get out of bed and go to work, and somebody else hops in the bed. Yuck. So the shipyard was having trouble keeping older and skilled workers, the ones that were needed most. And so shipyard President Homer Ferguson will go before the U.S. Senate and to receive financing from the U.S. Emergency Fleet Corporation, which was an agency of the U.S. War Shipping Board. And he says, look, unless you give us more money to build housing, we're not going to build the ships that you ask us to build. So immediately they build these block of tenement style apartments right across from the front gate of the shipyard, and the shipyard apartments. Then they'll start building the unique Garden City movement community of Warwick County. There's Arabella, and there's Eddie, and there's Hopkins. That's Victory Launching Day, by the way. Sometimes I forget to advance size. That's because I'm kind of focused on talking. There is Homer Ferguson. Oh gosh, see the piney woods? Well, that's where Hilton Village is going to be built. And Hilton Village is a unique Garden City movement community that they appear as English cottages, the churches, schools, a business district, access to the James River. They have everything. So actually, when the war ends, Eddie Huntington, because the government says, oh, we're not doing this anymore. So Eddie Huntington is going to say, well, I'm going to finish this. He will create a separate corporation to build the colony in, and he gets the village finished. And so that was pretty amazing. But the biggest change is going to be the Hampton Roads port of embarkation. Let me tell you, Thomas Wolfe, who worked, right, in the shipyard, he also worked on Langley Field. He was a student at Chapel Hill. And as a result of that, he'd get summer work. He said, if you had a hammer, even if you didn't know how to use it, you'd get a job. So he would say this about the port of embarkation. This is the second largest port of embarkation in the United States, second only to Newport, New York. So twice a week, the troops went through. They stood densely in brown, wearing thousands of there are thousands on the pier, while council officers table at the gangways went through their clearance papers. Then each below, the sweating torture of his pack, they were filled from the hot furnace of the pier into the even hotter prison of the ship. The great ships with their motley, jagged patches of deception weighted in the stream. They slid in and out in an ending squadron. This is a picture of Camp Stewart. And Camp Stewart was one of the largest port of embarkation camps. It handled 115,000 people. Now, another camp that would be located near here is going to be Camp Hill. And Camp Hill is where the motor transport soldiers are training. It also is where they send out the animals overseas. During the war, out of Camp Hill, they're going to process 33,704 horses and 24,474 mules. It is amazing. They could manage 10,000 animals with 900 workers. However, there's a great deal of racial prejudice that was existing back then. And as a result of they created the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War. They still have them. However, most of those units are going to be used as stevedores and other more manual labor actions. And consequently, they had to separate the camps, and they created what was known as Camp Alexander, that goes today from Mercury down Jefferson to around 54th Street. So nevertheless, this is Camp Morrison. This is where all the aviation people went overseas. Let me tell you, the final camp, major camp, is going to be Camp Eustis, now known as Fort Eustis. And it was the experimental shop at first for the Coast Artillery, because they were learning how to fire anti-aircraft guns and, of course, railway guns. And they're sending shells waiting in the marshes of Mulberry Island. And they also established what was known as Lee Hall Balloon School. And so in August alone, 46,130 soldiers were sent to France in 31 ships. A total of 261,820 soldiers went overseas from Newport News, and another 441,000 men came back. And so to build all these camps, you have to realize Newport News was overwhelmed with the need for workers, housing, etc. So, and the citizens of Newport News opened their heart and home to the soldiers that were coming in. The YMCA, that was located on 32nd Street, in 1 month alone provided 2,200 baths, slept 2,475 soldiers, and served 600 meals. Other organizations like the Salvation Army, the Jewish Warfare Board, the American Library Association endeavored to meet every need of the soldier. The Girls Patriotic League started knitting socks. However, they also made masks, because remember, all this is happening during the Spanish flu, which I'm going to talk about in a future program. So, you got thousands of people going through, even though, the citizens of Newport News were very kind to them. Some of the businesses on Washington Avenue kind of price gouged the soldiers, and they had a great celebration on November 11th, 1918. The war was over, which turned into a riot, and they broke into stores like Gem Cigars and, took the candy, took the cigars. But overall, it was a unique growth period for Newport News. As two doughboys they wrote this song that actually was a hit on Broadway, and it goes like this. Oh, Newport News blues is the latest fad. Newport News will surely drive you mad. You start into jazz, then razzmatazz. Oh, way down south in the land of cotton, your Uncle Sam has not forgotten. You're away you're far away from Broadway. They sing and dance that haunting melody. Oh, when you're down in Newport News, what do they want to play that daggone blues for? The blues of Newport News. Oh, news. Wow. So you can feel how all those guys felt, because Newport News was not, an advanced city. This is what it looked like right before you can see it's really a growing, but it once again doubles in size. One of the pictures down below, that's the Newport News Brewery, believe it or not. So we had homebrew beer, back in 1900. So that's pretty neat. And so what does this all mean? Well, let me tell you, in less than 60 years after the end of the Civil War, the city of Newport News was internationally known as a shipbuilding center with excellent port facilities. C.P. Huntington's vision had proven to be more than correct. Huntington laid the groundwork with his railroad, port, both connecting Newport News with all of the United States and nations throughout the world. Newport News surely became a boomtown during World War I, which provided the platform from which it grew into the thriving city it is today. So, wow, that's my story of the founding of Newport News for now. If you notice this slide, you can send me any type of questions or comments to my email. You can capture details of this lecture, which is far more than the lecture, at our website, marinersmuseum.org/blogs. And you can also subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel to access all these different lectures I've been doing. I can't believe how many I'm doing now. This is a great way to reach out. It's the mission of the Mariners Museum and Park to connect the waterways with men's use. And as a result of that, to try to provide content to people during this time of the plague. It is a great way. And I really appreciate you all listening and enjoying the programs, the YouTube programs, later or while you watch me here. And also, I truly appreciate you reading the blogs. I now am footnoting everything. It's kind of crazy, but I write about 3 blogs a month. And so I think they're enjoyable content. So without that, I just want to say thank you very much. I'm once again John Quarstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center. As I like to say, we should always sink before surrender. Thank you.
All right, John, that was great. So we've got a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
One question here is, how did Christopher Newport lose his arm?
Great. In, I think it's 1793. He was a noted pirate, or at least the Spanish called him a private. He would have been a privateer, and he had captured the year before the largest treasure ship captured by all the English sea dogs. And so he goes back and he wants to go capture some more. So he is climbing onto boarding a Spanish vessel, and he puts his hand on the gunwale where the Spanish soldier or seaman hit his hand with an axe. Right off the hand goes. So what does Christopher Newport do? In other words, he got blood spurting out. So he goes and flashes it with gunpowder, right? And so he goes on fighting. And so, and he becomes one of the 7 leading admirals of the high seas, according to the Lords of the Admiralty back in, I think that he got that title around 1603. So he was a bad bad privateer. He didn't care that his arm got chopped off. What did he do? He then put a hook on it. In fact, some people think that Captain Christopher Newport was the model for Captain Hook. And I just want to remind you all, the statue at Christopher Newport University is incorrect. He's got both hands. And so he came here to Newport News Point in 1607, sans his left hand. Okay, how's that?
That's great. I had no idea about that, actually.
Well, now you do.
Yeah.
I thought about sawing the hand off, but then I thought I might get in too much trouble with the statue, and it's not worth it for me. I don't saw much anymore. So anyway, okay, what's next?
Okay, so one other question here was Newport News picked as a port of embarkation due to the British shipping horses to resupply its troops for the previous 2.5 years?
Well, that was the start to it. But the real reasons, and it's in my blog, was the industry of the people in Newport News, the ability to repair ships in Newport News, the connection by rail throughout the entire United States. That means, everyone can get there. And it's on the midpoint of the Atlantic coast. Because of Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads is the world's largest harbor. Okay. So as a result of that, Newport News is right where the James River dumps into deep water. All those assets, plus the land was cheap. I mean, they bought Mulberry Island, where entire Fort Eustis, for $540,000. Right. And they had about, I think it's 201 families leave as a result of it. So, so Newport News was picked because of the railroad systems, the deep water port, the available land to build the camps, and the shipyard that's available to repair any ships that was necessary. So, yes, the English used that for the same daggum reasons. It's not written anywhere that I've seen, and that they made that decision based on what the British were doing. They made that decision based on just what was Newport News itself. If you all have been to New York and how huge the harbor is there, ours is a lot larger. And as a result of that, that's why they were named Port of Embarkation. And Newport News was named a Port of Embarkation. So I think it's all those factors that I said, all those factors that Huntington kind of understood when he decided to make his city on the banks of the James River. And Hampton Roads has never been the same since. It's grown far beyond everyone's needs. You can imagine, there's this sketch that after the war, the municipal survey done in Newport News had they were going to fill in Hampton Flats, which is this bar that goes from Salters Creek all the way to Hampton. And they were going to build more piers. They were going to build more shipbuilding faces. I mean, they thought they could, I guess, be the next New York City. I'm kind of glad they didn't, but that's what these community leaders all thought then. So the experience of World War I proved Huntington's point beyond all expectations. Okay.
Great. So looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat. We'll give somebody a couple of minutes to think about something. But I had a question that came up while you were talking. So was Huntington in violation of any antitrust laws with all of this vertical integration that he was doing in Newport News?
Well, the antitrust law is not really enforced until 1906, I believe, by Theodore Roosevelt. It had already been passed, but no one used it. Now, there's nothing wrong with Huntington buying the land, creating the railroad. There was a competing railroad over in Norfolk, so there's competition. There's no doubt he could build his own resort, but then recognize it wouldn't be as good as someone else. So he shared the use of the railroad with another money-making concern. He owned the coal, so, he owned the railroad, he owned the cars. Actually, they could make Huntington's West Virginia's secondary industry was making railroad cars. So get that, I mean, his firm and his wealth were never brought to court, even after Teddy Roosevelt begins this trust busting. The trust busting was really about, I have such a large concern like Standard Oil, and that I'm undercutting all the bidders, or I'm sharing with them the same price levels. And it's more than that, but really it's trying to X out competition. And I don't think Huntington was trying to do that. He was trying just to build his own city, his own port, his own railroad, his own everything, He was that kind of guy. But I do not think, in fact, I'm sure that the Huntington family was never tried for antitrust violations. They were accused of a lot of bribery, and that was C.P. Huntington. There's a great cartoon by Thomas Nast that shows Congress, and they all got wads of money in their pockets, and there stands Huntington speaking, and they're all voting for him, and all the money is, of course, I'm sold to CP for $10,000 or what have you. He had one of his lawyers, I think it was a lawyer, die, and before they could go and check his office, some unscrupulous other person checked it and found all of these lists of bribes and everything like that. Now, the people that should have gotten in trouble were the senators and representatives. However, they didn't. Neither did Huntington. He went through some shame, but he didn't care. Okay. I guess that's the bottom line, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I guess, it's funny. It's funny how that works out, right?
Well, just like the expansion of the shipyard, that's right before we had all the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. So they filled in land, they expanded the yard. That made the yard capable of meeting the Navy's needs of today. But if you tried to do that today, you'd be in big trouble.
Right. So you had briefly touched on this, but there was a question about the Spanish flu, specifically in relation to Newport News' port. Can you elaborate slightly on that?
Slightly. I'm going to be doing one of these programs on the great pandemic, Spanish flu. And, really, Newport News, everyone had to wear a mask. They closed the theaters. They closed every business, churches, what have you, except for war essential businesses. So the shipyard took extra steps to protect its workers. Less than 300 people in Newport News died from the Spanish flu. However, we do know that guys in the camps suffered greatly. In fact, one undertaker was ordered by the Army to send them 5,000 caskets. No one knew what to do with the Spanish flu. And so the soldiers, if they got the flu, there's a place now Camp Stewart went from Salters Creek to the small boat harbor, and it was all on the water. So they said, oh, these guys are so hot, let's cool them down. So this is November 1918. So they have open air wards, where if you had the Spanish flu, they put you in there and they hope you cool down. Instead, what did you do? You died. It was a bad plan. Um, so I think the comparisons, which I'll go into more detail in a later program. The big thing is we were at war, so all those war-related industries had to continue, but they closed government offices. They closed an awful lot. Theaters would have been great for the soldiers, but they said no, no, no. And the churches, and everyone did wear a mask. Because remember, the Girls Patriotic League are making them, the Red Cross are making them. I mean, this was, instead of socks, this is what the soldiers really needed, and the citizens really needed. So remember, over 650,000 Americans died from the Spanish flu. It came in 3 waves, and it was the industry of the citizens of Newport News themselves who followed the mandated mask wearing, the mandated closes of businesses, the closing of churches, closing of schools. Actually, what is now known as the Downing Growth Center in the southeast community of Newport News. That was a newly built school, and everyone says, well, no, we're not going to, children can't go to school, and so we're going to make it into a hospital, which they did. And that school, you didn't go back to school until 1919. And it's amazing that they still had to have these Liberty Loan drives. They still had to have these public expressions that thousands of people would attend, especially when the units were coming back home, like the 29th Infantry Division. Many of those people were from Newport News, Hampton, Chesapeake, Suffolk, and so forth. So, yeah, it was a very dangerous flu. And I'll just tell you one other thing. I don't want to ruin my next lecture, right? So, but I'll tell you one thing. It really wasn't discovered in Spain. That the King of Spain, Alfonso VIII, came down with it. And it made the news everywhere because England, France, the United States were practicing what? Censorship. So they didn't want all this stuff known. Actually, it started by a cook in Fort Riley, Kansas. And so all those doughboys that are going through there, they're now taking the Spanish flu to New York, to Newport News, and what they in Philadelphia. One other story is that once the first big drive ended and all the cases are going down, they said, "Yay! We don't have to wear masks. We don't have to do this. Let's have fun." And all of a sudden, the second wave came, which was even more deadly than the first. And they said, "Oh, hey, wear those masks." And so the parallels between the Spanish flu and the COVID-19, I call it the plague, is so similar. And so I know some people don't think history is important, but history teaches us so much about the past is a platform for us to move forward, and we should learn from the past. Okay? Anything else?
No, that looks like that was about it.
Well, great. Thank you all so much. You get a great huzzah. Contact me if you need to. You can see all the contact information on this slide. And until later then, huzzah. Okay? Thank you.
All right, so we're clear.